one of the most geologically important things that's happened in American history and also prehistory.
The great earthquakes of 1811, 1812, there's a lot of things we'll never know about them. What we know is that they were really big, they really happened, and they'll probably happen again.
The fact that 1811, 1812 was not a one-shot deal makes you think that New Madrid could produce a large earthquake.
The earthquake did, in fact, swallow up towns along the Mississippi River.
The whole landmass area was fluid, in some cases literally liquid, going on for several months and then even thereafter for a longer period.
There are absolutely no accounts from anyone of any foreshocks prior to the December 16.
But the fact remains that they've happened repeatedly in the past, and they'll probably happen again. They're not freak events.
On December 16, 1811, just after 2 a.m., the first in a series of massive earthquakes occurred, which launched the largest seismic event ever in North American history, and some say the most powerful release of seismic energy in the world for over 2,000 years. Scientists believe that several of these timbers were a magnitude 7.5 to 8.5. Over 2,000 earthquakes were felt and recorded by an engineer, Jared Brooks, in Louisville, Kentucky, over 200 miles away from any of the quake's epicenters. This colossal release of seismic energy did not take place on a tectonic plate boundary where most strong earthquakes occur, but rather in the heart of mid-America near the banks of the Mississippi River.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of historical information about the earthquakes of 1811, 1812. Some of the accounts are seemingly outrageous when you hear about the earthquake lights, those lights coming from the ground and massive amounts of debris coming up out of the ground being spewed forth with great impetuosity, as they would have said in the early 1800s, meaning it was associated with a lot of air and a lot of water and a lot of noise. And these are the same types of things that we've witnessed in other areas like the India earthquake of January 2001. Many similar instances where the ground looked like it just exploded and you had craters in the ground and volumes of dirt that just thrown out of these holes. This is much like what you heard about the accounts in New Madrid of 1811, 1812.
We now know that the earthquakes that occurred in 1811 and 12 occurred previously, at least twice before 1811 and 1812, with a roughly 500 years in between.
We do now have very good evidence of a past chronology of very large New Madrid earthquakes, and that's through the study of these liquefaction sand blow features that take very strong shaking to produce, and the whole New Madrid seismic zone is covered by these sand blows from 1811, 1812. We always thought they were all from 1811, 1812.
Mainly we see evidence of a big earthquake around 1450 AD and 900 AD. There are some hints of earlier earthquakes, one probably around 300 AD and perhaps some earlier ones, but our really good record probably goes back around 1200 years.
We do know from Indian legends that there was a similar episode of earthquakes on the New Madrid Fault, probably around 1350 or somewhere shortly before Columbus discovered this place. And we also have evidence of Indians' massive movements out of the area around 900 AD and then previously around 400 AD. So we're thinking that maybe those are evidence of major earthquakes that have occurred every 500 to 700 years in that fault zone.
There were very few people here. The accounts which have been written down tell us that the impact in the impacted area was simply enormous, with these sand blows shooting up, banks collapsing, river overflowing, all kinds of change going on. And it wasn't like it hit and it stopped. When we say 1811 to 1812, we are meaning, in the broadest sense, that the whole landmass area was fluid, in some cases literally liquid, going on for several months and then even thereafter for a longer period.
The town of Little Prairie, Missouri, population 200 near current-day Caruthersville, was one of several communities consumed by the Mississippi River during the great earthquakes of 1811 and 12.
About midday, a big gap opened up in the middle of the town, a great big fissure, and there were fumes of rotten vegetation that was in the ground. It smelled like sulfur to them. And they said the groundwater was warm. So they really thought that the gates of hell literally were opening up in their town. They were religious people. So there was a lot of religious fear.
The cultural aspect of this, in addition to the stories, is that we need to relate this to the culture of the times. Today, most people would treat earthquakes as the study for science. In 1811, most people treated earthquakes as God's particular plan for somebody. I mean, there were no accidents. If your house was struck by lightning, it was because God wanted it struck by lightning. Which is why in the 17th and 18th centuries, if your house was struck by lightning, no one would help you put it out. They'd defend other houses against the fire spreading, but you got what you deserved.
Of course, the greatest event or the greatest feature caused from the 1811-1812 earthquakes was the formation of Reelfoot Lake, which at the time was about 40, right after it formed, was about 40 square miles according to the historic records. It's about 20 square miles now. It's been silting in. But it's the largest natural body of water in the state of Tennessee, and it was formed by a relatively recent earthquake, not from a big dam or not from anything that we did. This is from the forces of nature forming its own dam, its own natural dam, and making a lot of areas subside, sink, and that filled in with water. Reelfoot Lake can be viewed today, and it's direct evidence of the types of earthquakes that we have here. They changed the face of the earth. Given here in the central United States, because of the river and because of the soft sediments, a lot of times you don't see these features, mountains, faults, fissures like you see in other areas that are more active or equally as active.
Southeast Missouri has been called Swamp-East Missouri. Most people didn't realize that before 1811 and 12 it wasn't that way. There was good drainage and there was a lot of streams and there was a few lowlands and swamps in there. But after the earthquakes, when all the drainage had been broken up, huge swamps were created. And some of them 40 miles long. And new ponds and lakes were created. In fact, they were there for over 100 years. They weren't drained until the 1920s. And a major engineering project to help drain and recapture this land, because it was great farmland before the earthquake. After the earthquake, it was almost unusual because it was all broken up and underwater and swampy. So that was solved in the 1920s, but there was at least a dozen lakes created by the earthquake, and there's only two left today that I know of. One of them is Reelfoot Lake over on the Tennessee side. One is Big Lake, which straddles the Missouri-Arkansas border, and the Missouri end of it has already been drained, but I think the Arkansas end still has water. And it's really an eerie feeling to see these huge lakes with live cypress trees standing in them that were there before the earthquake. Cypresses live to be 400, 500, 600 years old. They don't sprout underwater. They like swampy conditions, but they don't grow in lakes. But here's trees growing in lakes that were sunk back during those earthquakes, and they're still there today.
During 1811-1812, this was the western frontier of the United States. Louisiana Purchase was in 1803. Basically, it's a very underdeveloped area, maybe 4,000 to 5,000 non-Native Americans living between St. Louis and Natchez. We do know that 18 earthquakes from the New Madrid sequence in that winter were felt along the Atlantic seaboard, Charleston up to New Jersey, some people say. Well, for an earthquake to happen here in New Madrid and to be felt along the Atlantic seaboard, it needs probably to be at least a 6. Many say 6.5. 3 of those 18 earthquakes were felt into Canada. Most scientists believe that for an earthquake to happen here and to be felt in Canada, it needs to be very large. Magnitude 7.5, magnitude 8, somewhere in there.
We now know the great seismic activity occurred in the New Madrid seismic zone at least 3 times before the great earthquakes of 1811 and 12. We also know that 2 large earthquakes have occurred since, in 1843 near Mark Tree, Arkansas, and 1895 near Charleston, Missouri. What we don't know is when or where the next large earthquakes will occur in the New Madrid seismic zone. In November of 1989, Dr. Ivan Browning, a climatologist and businessman from New Mexico, made a statement concerning earthquake activity in the heart of mid-America. He predicted that due to the alignment of the sun and the moon and the tidal forces they created, there was a 50% chance that a major earthquake would take place somewhere in the New Madrid seismic zone on or about December 3rd, 1990. Over the next year, Browning's projection and the responses from the scientific community, coupled with the reaction and sensationalism of the media, would lead to confusion and, in some cases, hysteria among the people living near the New Madrid seismic zone.
The whole Ivan Browning episode really began in October of 1989, actually October the 17th, 1989, when a very strong earthquake occurred in Northern California. It's called the World Series earthquake because a World Series game was in progress, which it interrupted. Just after that earthquake occurred, Ivan Browning gave a presentation in San Francisco, and rather offhandedly, he mentioned that it wasn't just California that had a significant earthquake risk. There was also another significant risk in the central U.S. Now, he was telling this to California people, and that really caught their attention. And he pointed out during the course of his remarks that there was a very good chance that the central U.S. would have a very damaging earthquake on December the 3rd, 1990, because of the research that he had done in tidal forces, where there would be a certain amount of pressure on the crust at that time, and that would possibly cause a large earthquake to occur.
It was a pseudo-scientific basis he did it on. He did it on the fact that the Earth's crust is also subjected to tidal stresses generated by the gravity of the sun and moon. So it's just like the oceans. The ocean tides are controlled by the gravity of the sun and moon, but that's a fluid, so you can slosh it around. That's what we high and low tides. The solid crust flexes or deforms ever so slightly in response to the changing gravity tug of the sun and moon. And it's true that at December 3rd, 1990, that tidal stress was at a maximum for the last century or so.
In this rare footage from 1990, Dr. Browning explains why he thinks a major earthquake could occur in early December of that year.
There's enough energy stored up in the New Madrid Fault for a 7+ Richter earthquake. So the gun apparently is loaded, although whether or not it's cocked remains to be seen. But the enormous triggering force on December the 2nd, 1990, will really give it a chance to go off if it's at all likely to. It is the highest probability of any day for the remainder of the century.
Well, it didn't get much news coverage, actually, at that point. There was one newspaper in San Francisco who did carry it, and as a result of that coverage, it was picked up by a newspaper in Missouri, which reported on this talk and reported on his statements. And we got some phone calls as a result of that story. It got very local play, pretty much, but it was an AP story. And our standard response to anything about earthquake prediction was that it wasn't possible. No one can make an earthquake prediction. We'd never heard of this man named Ivan Browning at that time, and it was pretty much forgotten.
Press coverage did not make clear that he had no specialty in earthquakes. And you could go around and talk to most of the professionals in the field who discounted this roughly 90%. And of course, there's obvious reason for discounting at 90%, like a 100-year flood. A 100-year flood, in theory, will happen 1 year within a 100-year period. It could be this year. And there certainly were arguments at the time that an earthquake was due or overdue.
So nobody could say there would not be an earthquake on December the 3rd. It's absolutely impossible for anybody to say that. I mean, it could have been a magnitude 2, but that's what the public wanted to hear.
Now, what happened next? Well, people bought water. People did all sorts of things. And secured dried food and waited for the great event.
But it still wasn't a real region-wide media event until early August in 1990. And for some reason, and no one knows where it came from or how it happened, it was reported on a local station that the prediction date had been changed from December the 3rd, 1990 to August 1990. And of course the story broke, everybody carried it, people became seriously alarmed for reasons that were very understandable given the coverage that had happened up until that time. And we got hundreds and hundreds of phone calls from people who wondered if that were the case. Many people that we asked where they had seen it or heard it said, they'd seen it on a memo that was circulated at Federal Express that for some reason no one had copied. So we couldn't get any hard copy of this, and also the radio station story, but no one could say what station that they had heard it.
On September 26, 1990, a magnitude 4.6 earthquake, epicentered 10 miles southwest of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, was felt in 7 states. This small quake left already jittery residents of the New Madrid seismic zone wondering if it was a foreshock to the great quakes predicted by Iben Browning to occur on December 3rd of that year.
National media just swooped down on the central U.S. And we had not been tremendously experienced with dealing with large-scale national media before, unlike California with their relatively frequent earthquakes. So it was a real learning experience for us because that's a whole different realm of media coverage when these people move in.
They came down to cover it, rented every single motel room in Sykeston. You couldn't find a place to stay. They were all down to see this event.
The positive side, and there were a lot of positives that resulted from this, and that is that really for the first time in our earthquake history, the attention of the entire region, and it is a regional problem, was focused on this one particular very significant hazard that we have here. And despite all the years of all the education that we had done, as well as many other agencies, it still had been fairly scattershot, but this really brought the whole notion of earthquake risk as an issue that not just one state or 2 states have to deal with, but an issue that 8 or 9 or 10 states have to deal with.
Did this call attention to the lamentably poor state of local disaster preparedness? Yes. So its long-term effect was to greatly improve the way that government facilities would react to such an event.
When December 3rd, 1990 came and went with no earthquake in the New Madrid seismic zone, Dr. Browning was asked if he had any regrets about his prediction. His reply was that the only regret he would have had is if he had not made his projection known and a major earthquake had occurred. Dr. Iben Browning died in July 1991. As the people in the cities and towns in the New Madrid seismic zone go about their daily business, it's difficult to imagine that a series of great earthquakes ever occurred here. It's even harder to think that it could happen again.
After all, the New Madrid seismic zone is located in the heart of America, and large earthquakes rarely take place in the middle of a continent, nowhere near a tectonic plate boundary. It's also been nearly 200 years since the great earthquakes of 1811 and 12. The reminders of these earthquakes are few. 2 lakes that were formed at the time, and sand boils that dot the countryside are about all you can find. So should the people of mid-America be concerned about earthquakes? While earthquakes in these settings are rare, they are not unprecedented. In January 2001, in the state of Gujarat, India, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake rocked the area. Tens of thousands of people were killed, and the damage was horrendous. Gujarat, like New Madrid, is not located on a plate boundary, and also, like New Madrid, had not had a major earthquake for nearly 200 years.
New Madrid is what we call an intraplate setting. It occurs far from the boundaries of the Earth's tectonic plates. According to the theories of plate tectonics, we shouldn't have earthquakes in the middle of plates.
The Bhuj earthquake of January 2001 in northwestern India in the state of Gujarat was a magnitude 7.6 earthquake.
That area has a lot of geological similarities to the New Madrid seismic zone and offers us the opportunity to study a big earthquake sort of firsthand, up close and personal. And from that, what we learn there, apply it to what we might expect to see here, where we haven't, at least in modern times, had a major earthquake.
The India earthquake, again in a similar setting to ours, was felt for great distances, 2,000 kilometers, 1,200 miles in any direction. The state estimates for casualties range up to about 30,000. The federal estimates for casualties range up into 80 or 90,000. My guess is that it's somewhere between there. The last big earthquake that happened in Gujarat was in 1819. Most people would believe that we should have an earthquake about every 5,000 or 10,000 years of that size. Well, here's an earthquake, a very large earthquake that happened 200 years later.
The vast majority of the damage could be attributed to poor building practice. And it really drove home the need for good building practices.
It's rather eerie to hear them say, you know, we knew we had an earthquake a long time ago and we thought there might be a possibility, but we never thought it could be anything could be this bad.
Unreinforced masonry buildings are the most susceptible to earthquake damage. Many public buildings and most schools in the New Madrid seismic zone are unreinforced masonry, including this school in New Madrid, Missouri, that was built on the top of what some say was the epicenter of the last great earthquake in 1812. But should mid-Americans be alarmed? What are the probabilities of another New Madrid earthquake?
In the next 50 years, the likelihood of a magnitude like the earthquakes in 1811 and 12, and they were probably a mid-7 or greater range. We don't know the magnitudes precisely, is about 7 to 10%. That's a bit higher than the 1985 estimates. For magnitude 6 and greater, the likelihood is about 25 to 40%.
In 1976, there was a magnitude 5 earthquake in Martree, Arkansas. That earthquake was felt in 7 states, which is unprecedented in terms of California earthquakes. A magnitude 5, you might not feel it in the next county. That magnitude 5 caused limited architectural damage all over the central United States, including Memphis. It did limited architectural damage and some structural damage to fire departments in the Memphis area, when many other buildings were unscathed. Now, building codes, one of the most important things they do is outline which facilities are critical and that those facilities should perform to a higher standard. So since that time, the city of Memphis has gone to a good effort to make sure that the fire departments are built to where they will be there to serve the public after an earthquake.
How about the gas and electric lines going through the region? It's interesting that San Francisco, an earthquake-prone city, has put its utilities underground, where they're much safer than they are up in the air. People were familiar in the year 2002 and elsewhere earlier in the state with the effect of ice storms and their ability to take down whole rows of electric poles. Well, an earthquake would be even more devastating and virtually end electricity service in northeastern Arkansas and southeastern Missouri.
The effects on the entire infrastructure could be tremendous. Many highways and railroads could be rendered virtually useless, slowing shipping nationwide and causing great economic damage to the entire country, as well as hindering rescue efforts in the region.
Earthquakes don't happen that often, but if they do happen here, they will affect a very large area. It's different than planning for a tornado or something like that, where you're talking about being able to call your nearest neighbor. In a big New Madrid earthquake, our nearest neighbor that's going to be able to help us would be somewhere in Oklahoma or Nebraska.
And while infrastructure damage is a major problem, there is another serious threat rolling throughout the New Madrid seismic zone.
What if this comes during one of these high water periods on the Mississippi? There could be major serious problems and damage equal to the 1927 or 1937 floods in such an event.
In 1811 and 12, the area most affected by the great earthquakes had a population of less than 15,000 people. Today, the same area is home to nearly 15 million people. A repeat of the great earthquakes now would most likely be the most devastating natural disaster ever in United States history. Although no one knows when or where, how large or how often, there is one certainty. Big earthquakes will once again occur in the New Madrid seismic zone.